All right, so group 1, model number 7. As you go left to right on the periodic table, what happens to electronegativity? It increases, yep. And what two elements did you pick to compare? Li and N. Perfect. So here's a lithium, and here would be one of those. I guess it's this one here, nitrogen. All right, so how would you draw lithium?
2 rings.
Yep.
And
Plus 1. And group 2, how would you draw nitrogen? Nitrogen? Five plus? 2 rings. Okay. Group 3, what do we need to add to our picture up here to show that it's electronegativity? What is electronegativity measuring? Right, we need to show some electrons being shared. So it doesn't really matter what atom you pair it with. I'm just going to say atom X. Here's this kind of Venn diagram model. So these 2 electrons are being shared between these 2 atoms. And group 4, tell me why nitrogen pulls those electrons more. That's a plus 5. Coulomb's law says bigger charges, bigger attraction. So there's going to be a much bigger attraction between a plus 5 and those negatives. And that's going to cause that nitrogen to pull those electrons in this direction. That'll make this end of the molecule partially positive, so that's one way to show that. Or maybe in biology class you saw the delta symbol for partially positive and partially negative. Can anybody tell me what concept that is from biology class? A molecule that has an N that's partially positive and an N that's partially negative. Vic?
Polarity.
That would be polarity. So we'll actually have a half of a unit on polarity and all that good stuff 2 units from now, but the whole reason is a difference in electronegativity. What was probably the most polar molecule you talked about in biology class? Which one? H2O, water. So let's take a look at the H's and O's. What's the core charge on hydrogen? Plus, quick show me a number of fingers. Hydrogen would have a core charge of plus. Just be respectful. That's plus 1. Whereas oxygen would have a core charge of plus. Quick show of fingers. Yeah, column 16 would be a plus 6. So who's going to pull the electrons more, H's or O's? The O's would. And that's going to pull the electrons towards the oxygen, and that's why it's called electronegativity. You pull electrons, that's going to cause you to be negative, so the oxygen end of water is negative, the hydrogen end would be positive. It's all based on electronegativity. Any questions on that? All right, I think we're up to group 5. What happens to electronegativity as you go down the periodic table? It decreases. Good. And what 2 elements did you compare to basically explain that? Yep, carbon and silicon. So here's carbon, here's silicon. How would you draw carbon? Yep, 4 plus. Here's some atom X sharing some electrons. Group 6, even though you might have not picked silicon, this is good practice. How would you draw silicon? Put somebody in a jail cell telling bad jokes? You silly con.
4 plus.
Yep, 4 plus. 3 rings. And here's atom X sharing electrons. Group 7, can you tell me why silicon pulls those electrons less? Right, there's more space or a larger radius between those 2 charges. And what does Coulomb's law say about larger distances and attraction? Good, there'd be a much weaker attraction here. So this is a weaker attraction, whereas this would be a stronger attraction. There you go. That's it. So carbon would pull those electrons more, and that would cause this end of the molecule to be positive. Any questions on that? All right, that's model 7. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at model 8, ionization energy. Group 1, what happens to ionization energy as you go across the periodic table? It increases. And what 2 elements did you pick to support that? RB and SR. Good. How would you draw RB? Five rings. Yep. And here's okay, that's good for now. Group 2, how would you draw strontium, even though that might not be the element you picked? Yep. 5 rings. And group 3, what do we want to add to our picture up here to show that it's ionization energy? So if you remember, for electron affinity, we showed an electron being stolen. For electronegativity, we showed bonded electrons being pulled. What's happening with ionization energy? An electron is leaving. So it would be the easiest electron to rip off. So here's one electron being removed, and here's one electron being removed. Group 4, what's stopping you from ripping off that electron? Why doesn't that electron want to get ripped off? Right, the +1 is holding it in place. It's attracting. Coulomb's law. So group 5, what are you going to have to add to these atoms up here to get those electrons to pop off? Ionization. Ionization. Energy. So you're going to get this electron excited by giving it energy. So energy goes in, the electron goes out. Energy goes in, so therefore the electron goes out. So now we're trying to figure out, well, which is going to take more energy or less energy. Group 6, why does strontium have a higher ionization energy? Right, it's got a higher core charge, so there's more attraction between a +2 and a negative, so it's going to need more energy, or more energy to ionize that atom. Perfect. Questions on that? Just Coulomb's law. Coulomb's law is literally the explanation for almost everything in this unit. Group 7, what happens as you go down the periodic table? It decreases. And what 2 elements did you pick to compare? Neon and argon. How would you draw neon?
Let's say
18 or 8?
Okay,
8, okay.
and then 2
Yep, 2 rings. Here's an electron being removed. And then group 1, how would you draw argon? And here's some electron being removed. Group 2, tell me about the energy needed to rip off those electrons. Which one's going to need less energy? Okay, why any? Okay, so you're saying that this +8 is closer to this negative? Is that true? +8 is closer to the negative? What would Coulomb's law say about 2 charges that are closer together? A stronger attraction. So is it going to take more energy to rip off that electron or less energy? So these are super strongly attracted. It'll be easy to rip it off? Johnny? It'll take more energy, right? So more energy. Because this negative is so far away from that +8, that's going to be a weaker attraction, so it'll take less energy. Coulomb's law. Questions about that? All right, it would be nice if everything was that easy, but again, we have some exceptions here. Not that they're exceptions, but we just need a more fancy model to fully explain it. So we want to take a look at beryllium and boron. So here's beryllium, and here is boron. So beryllium would be a +2, or a 2+ with 2 rings around it. Here's this electron we're trying to rip off, and boron would be a 3+, and we're trying to rip off that electron. Would you agree a +3 would attract that electron more? Right, a +3 would be more attractive. So it should take more energy to rip off that electron. But when you look at the data right here, you'd expect boron to be up here because it's a +3, but something is causing it to be less than what it should be. So group 3, what model are we going to have to draw? Yeah, the orbital diagrams, which is kind of a picture representation of our quantum mechanical model. So I'll get you started with helium. What are you going to add after helium? 2s, 2, good. 1 box, 2 electrons. Perfect. Group 4, how are you going to draw boron?
2s2.
So 2s2? 2p1. Ooh, that's different. So 2 electrons. How many boxes for the p's? 3. And 1 electron. So group 5, which electron are we going to rip off in beryllium? Yeah, something from the 2s group. It doesn't really matter which one. And let's just say you have to get the electron out here for it to be considered ripped off. So it's going to take this much energy, or ionization energy, to rip off that electron. Group 6, which electron are we going to rip off in boron? The p1. Why? Right, it's in the outermost shell. Now, technically, these are both in energy level 2, but we now know that we subdivide ring 2 into s's orbitals and p orbitals. And would you agree the p electron would be easier to rip off? And that is the definition of first ionization energy, the energy needed to rip off the easiest electron. You only have to put in this much energy to rip off that electron. Would you agree S and P electrons are not the same as far as energy is concerned? P electrons are already higher in energy, so it won't take as much energy to rip off a P electron. So again, it's not really an exception, it's just that our more detailed model is needed to fully explain it. Ripping off an electron from energy level 2 is not identical. It could be a 2s electron or it could be a 2p electron. 2p electrons are easier to rip off. Any questions on that? All right, then let's go ahead and take a look at the next exception. But again, it's not really an exception. We're looking at sulfur versus phosphorus. So with phosphorus, you have a 5+ with 3 rings of electrons. Here's this electron you're trying to rip off. And here's a +6 with 3 rings of electrons, and here's this electron you're trying to rip off. Which one of these should have a higher ionization energy? We'll go 5 for phosphorus or 6 for sulfur. Which should take more energy to rip off the electron? Phosphorus or sulfur? Good show of fingers. Yeah, it definitely has to be sulfur, right? +6 is more attractive. But when you look at the data, something seems a little, man, that's really hard to read. Sulfur and phosphorus. Oh, right here. You would expect sulfur to be up here, but for some reason, something's causing it to be less than it should be. Well, how are we going to fix that? So, I think we're up to group 7. What do we have to draw for phosphorus? Orbital diagram? Yep, so you're going to start with what, neon? Repeat 3, good. 1 box with 2 electrons for 3s2, 3 boxes. And how are you going to put 3 electrons in 3 boxes? 1 in each. Any questions about that? Group 1, how would you do the same picture for sulfur? You start with neon. Yep, 3s2. 3p4. It's pretty much the same, just 1 extra electron. That can't be that big of a difference. How do you put 4 electrons in 3 boxes?
There's 1 in each.
Yep.
2 in the first box.
And that second one in that first box. Any questions about boxes? Group 2, which electron are we going to rip off for phosphorus? Are we going to rip off a 3s electron or a 3p electron? If you're trying to get the electron out to this imaginary energy level to say it's been ripped off, which would be an easier electron, a p or an s? A p, yeah, it's going to take this much energy. Does it really matter which one you pick? No, they're all the same. They're called degenerate energy, same energy. This is the crux of this one though. Group 4, which would be the easiest electron to rip off from sulfur? 1 in the p orbitals. Now, are all the electrons in the p orbitals the same? No, we've got electrons that are paired up in the same box, where we have unpaired electrons. What can you tell me about 2 electrons in the same box? They're going to repel each other. So it's almost like this electron is kind of pushing this electron out the door. Group 4, how's that going to affect the energy needed to rip off that electron? So this electron has to go from here to here to be ripped off. This one kind of gets a head start. That other electron's kind of shoving it out the door. And now we need to go from here to here. How does that compare? It needs less energy. Because of this repulsion, this electron now needs less energy to get ripped off. Again, it's not an exception. It's totally Coulomb's law. 2 electrons repel each other, so that'll make that electron easier to rip off. Again, our cute little ring model does not have enough detail to show that. Our SPDF quantum mechanical model will fully explain that. It matches perfectly with the data from the graph. Questions with that? All right, so that is pretty much the unit in a nutshell. Before we move on to some lab demos, let's take one more look at this question, but now answer it from the ionization energy perspective. Why do some atoms break the trends in ionization energy? What do you want to add to that? Well, you guys are feverishly discussing that question. I'm going to pass out your lab. Don't let that distract you from your conversations. All right, back as a whole group. Number 11. Alex, what are you adding to your answer from the other day? Why do some atoms break ionization energy trends? What might make it easier to rip off an electron than what you might originally predict? Say that one more time. So it's this question up here, why do some atoms break the trends in ionization energy? In other words, what was the explanation to some of the exceptions to ionization energy? Right, maybe the electron you're trying to rip off is already paired with another electron in a box. That would make it easier to rip off that electron because of the repulsion. And then the last thing, let's talk about B versus BE. It was actually easier to rip the electron off of boron, even though it has a +3 core charge, than it was beryllium with only a +2 core charge. What was the explanation there? Number 2, Ryan. What's the difference between the electron we ripped off in B versus BE? What orbital was the B electron in? S or P? It's in the P group. Whereas BE, element 4, is in which group? The S group. Which is an easier electron to rip off? A P electron or an S electron? A P, because it's already higher in energy. So ripping electrons out of an energy level aren't always the same. You have to look at what orbital it's in. A P electron would be easier to rip off than an S electron. Any questions on that? So paired electrons have repulsion, making it easier to rip off electrons, and energy level 2, 3, 4 electrons are not all identical. There's a difference between P electrons and S electrons. Any questions? All right, so this would be a good time to put your goggles on. And we are going to take a look at your lab packet. So let me pull up a digital copy here. We need an extra one?
Got it.
Okay.